From the very first idol, carved to stare into the firelight, humanity has asked a powerful question. Did our ancient gods spring from imagination, or from memory? Myths rarely emerge from a vacuum. As forgotten ruins rise from deserts and jungles, those old stories start to feel less symbolic and more like a documentary. They hint at encounters that were misunderstood, recorded with fear and reverence, and eventually refined into worship. We're left with a question that history often avoids. Were the gods just metaphors, or were they rulers, teachers, or even survivors of a world we've forgotten? When legends of beings with wings, light, and incredible knowledge repeat across separate continents, coincidence starts to feel like a weak explanation. History is finally starting to listen more closely. Ancient legends from around the world describe beings who arrived after a great catastrophe. They taught humanity agriculture, astronomy, and law, and then they either left or disappeared. Archaeology complicates this picture, revealing lost civilizations capable of feats we once thought were only possible for gods. Think of the massive stonework, the precise astronomical alignments, and technologies that somehow survive floods and climate disasters. We even have ancient maps that seem to show coastlines before the ice caps melted and the seas rose, implying someone remembered an earlier version of Earth. So-called forbidden texts expand on this, describing luminous teachers and travelers from the sky accounts that were later softened into religious stories. Because accepting that advanced ancestors existed disrupts our entire sense of linear history, challenging power, faith, and authority structures that have stood for centuries. Now, archaeology alone doesn't prove that gods were real beings, but it does reveal a pattern of suppression. Whenever a discovery challenges the official timeline, political and religious influence often steps in. Evidence is reclassified as ritual or myth. Ancient texts that describe gods as flesh and blood rulers are dismissed as heresy. Yet, when we look at climate records, we see cycles of collapse that strangely match the stories of divine wars and punishments, suggesting that a real memory was encoded into theology. Today, modern technology is re-examining these links, scanning ruins and translating ancient tablets. It forces us to ask whether the idea of divinity was used to mask advanced knowledge, intentionally hidden to maintain control over emerging civilizations. So why do we often see gods as lost? Perhaps because the memory of leadership survived long after the context was lost. Ancient wars described as divine conflicts aligned perfectly with periods of resource scarcity and climate stress, suggesting gods were a way to personify power during a crisis. Textbooks tend to avoid this overlap because reducing gods to historical figures can destabilize core belief systems. Archaeology still faces resistance when it interprets temples as administrative centers, not just places of worship. But as technology uncovers forgotten infrastructure buried beneath sacred sites, it points more toward organized governance than pure magic. These questions remain controversial because gods are central to our identity and morality. But the search continues, comparing myths, climate, data, and artifacts. As we gaze upon the stone faces once worshipped, we must ask, did reverence preserve a memory, or did it erase a much more interesting truth? What if the gods of antiquity weren't gods at all? As our research deepens, these divine figures start to look less eternal and more like powerful historical figures, shaped by crises, survival, and memory. Ancient texts often describe them aging, dying, or being overthrown teals that don't quite fit with absolute divinity, but perfectly match leaders guiding humanity through collapse. Archaeology backs this up, uncovering elite burials beneath ancient temples, suggesting that worship was built on top of remembrance. Climate data even aligns divine wrath with real-world droughts, floods, and cooling events. It seems gods were a way to personify forces and figures beyond comprehension, later mythologized as omnipotent to stabilize societies facing constant uncertainty. Ancient maps blur the lines even further, depicting realms ruled by gods that match real geography, now lost to rising seas. These charts suggest that someone witnessed these dramatic environmental changes firsthand. Forbidden texts add another layer, describing flying machines and radiant beings with advanced knowledge, often dismissed as mere poetry. But modern analysis is uncovering technical descriptions hidden within the allegory. When these texts resurface, they often sidelined because reframing gods as advanced predecessors disrupts established religious authority, and systems of belief that have shaped our world for centuries. This narrative has always been carefully guarded. Gods legitimize rule, and rulers become divine by association. When archaeology uncovers temples that also served as administrative centers and astronomical observatories, it threatens that sacred distinction. Modern tech now reveals complex infrastructure beneath holy site storage and urban planning, pointing to organized governance, not supernatural mystery. Questioning the gods feels taboo, not because it's forbidden, but because it's protected by reverence. Education reinforces symbolic interpretations while steering clear of material analysis. Yet, interdisciplinary research is bridging the gap between mythology, archaeology, and climate science. This work reveals gods as memory containers, encoding critical knowledge of catastrophe, survival strategies, and the leaders who guided reconstruction. This doesn't diminish ancient belief. It reveals its profound function. The gods become reflections of human resilience and our desperate need for meaning during collapse. They are archives, not entities, storing lessons and stories that outlasted stone. As we decipher these narratives, the past speaks with a new urgency, reminding us that gods rose when systems failed. And if similar pressures return, new gods may emerge again, not from the heavens, but from our own fear, memory, and search for order. When we look back at the ancient gods, we're not seeing visitors from another world. We're seeing a reflection of ourselves, humanity staring into a mirror during its most desperate times. Think about it. When civilizations were on the brink, facing collapsing environments, mass migrations, or devastating wars, what did they do? They elevated figures who represented order, memory, and survival. Archaeology confirms this. These godlike figures appear right at the edge of catastrophe, precisely where societal continuity was most threatened. Ancient legends weren't just bedtime stories. They were survival guides. They encoded the authority of these figures into myth, ensuring obedience would last for generations. Why? Because when systems fail, stories endure. The gods became vessels, carrying practical knowledge: how to farm, how to build, to govern, disguised as divine commands. This wisdom was passed down through centuries of chaos and forgetting. Modern technology is pulling back the curtain on this process. We can now compare myths from different continents, align their timelines, and see the same patterns emerging everywhere. Sky gods, floodbringers, lawgivers, they all tend to show up right after a major environmental shock. When satellite data of ancient ruins is laid over descriptions from old texts, what was once dismissed as coincidence now looks like consistency. Forbidden texts that were once called fantasies now read like fragmented reports from survivors trying to make sense of unimaginable loss. But this revelation faces resistance. Why? Because reframing gods as a historical response to crises, rather than as eternal truths, shakes the very foundations of identity, belief, and power. It forces us to confront a difficult idea: that much of our historical authority was ungranted from the heavens, but constructed right here on Earth to manage our collective fear. Our schools and institutions still struggle with this. Questioning the gods feels like unraveling the very fabric of meaning. So, this reinterpretation is often softened, slowed down, or dismissed as mere speculation. But the evidence keeps piling up. Archaeologists uncover workshops beneath shrines and signs of governance beneath places of worship. Climate science reinforces the timeline, showing that belief in powerful gods intensified exactly when life became most uncertain. It suggests gods weren't about explaining the universe, but about surviving it. They gave form to chaos when comprehension failed, uniting people for collective endurance. Perhaps the most unsettling insight is that gods tend to fade when stability returns. They retreat into ritual and symbolism as social systems solidify, only to re-emerge when pressure builds again. We see this cycle repeat: collapse, elevation of a divine authority, consolidation, and then a slow forgetting of why it was needed. As we now face our own accelerating challenges: climate change, resource scarcity, political division, the conditions that once birthed gods are quietly reassembling around us. We might not use the same names, but the impulse is the same. We seek figures, ideologies, or even technologies that we can elevate beyond question, because reverence simplifies fear and obedience feels safer than uncertainty when the systems we rely on begin to fracture. The truth behind the ancient gods isn't just buried in the past, it might be waiting in our future. When knowledge becomes fragmented and fear takes hold, humanity doesn't just invent gods, it remembers how to. If we fail to understand why they were needed before, we are likely to create them again. Not carved from stone this time, but perhaps coded into our networks, crowned in our politics, or celebrated in our culture. And history will just watch silently as we repeat the pattern, calling it destiny, faith, or progress, while the cycle closes once more. Thanks for watching.